the information provided from our Premier's office is that there was no advance notice, and there was no advance notice of topic. There's no time to gather information or brief the Premier on the Emergencies Act because it was unclear.
Hey everyone, William Diaz here with Rebel News, and today we'll take a look at what went on during the 21st day of the Emergencies Act inquiry. On November 10th, 2022, the Commission was on break on November 11th for Remembrance Day. This inquiry is taking place because Justin Trudeau invoked the Emergencies Act on peaceful protesters who were part of the Freedom Convoy back in February, who were simply protesting federal COVID-19 mandates. You can see and support our independent coverage of the inquiry here at truckercommission.com. The witnesses who appeared in front of the commission were Marlon DeGrand, Assistant Deputy Minister of the Public Safety Division and Director of Law Enforcement for Alberta Justice and Solicitor General, and Mario Di Tomaso, Deputy Solicitor General of Community Safety at the Ministry of Solicitor General. DeGrand was the first one to testify. Here's what he had to say.
The RCMP, as the police force of jurisdiction, made their efforts, and they had some limited success very early on, very early on, first days. That support dissolved from industry quite quickly. They went afield, and that was local support. They went afield and garnered some limited support, which also quite quickly dissolved. And then they were struggling after that to find any support anywhere, both within the province and commercially outside of the province, BC, Saskatchewan. I believe they might even have looked to commercial entities in the south, but I'm not 100% certain of that. I'll let them speak to that. They approached us to indicate the challenges that we're facing, and they indicated that they were going through their channels to seek support from the Canadian government for the use of heavy lift capacity that exists at the Canadian Forces Base in Edmonton.
DeGrand is with the Alberta government, and though the border was blocked during some periods by truckers and farmers at the Coutts border, the Alberta government has come out against the use of the Emergencies Act to dissipate the protesters. That protest was resolved before the Emergencies Act was even used. You can see the story of Coutts by journalists who were there at truckerdocumentary.com. DeGrand also testified that he was not aware by February 13th that the Emergencies Act was about to be invoked.
Under the heading Alberta, it says that the biggest operational challenge to date is procuring, towing, wrecking equipment and skilled workers to operate the equipment.
That's correct.
By this point, you had most of that equipment at least.
The information that that Talal in this message was referencing came from a point in time prior to us having finalized the purchase of the last of the equipment. So we were still looking for trucks when he and I had a conversation, and his reference to our conversation contained in this email to Rob Stewart is based on that sort of time-dated information that we were still looking for it.
Of course. And by that point on February 13th, you had no idea that the federal government was about to invoke the Emergencies Act.
That's correct, sir.
Moving on to the second witness of the day who testified that day, we take a look at Di Tomaso's testimony. Take a look at some of what he testified to.
Federal Emergency Act measures were put in place to help solve what you've indicated was a policing matter, so a law enforcement issue. Did you see any concern about using federal measures to deal with what is substantially a provincial matter, which is policing?
No, because the Emergencies Act invocation, from my view, was national in scope. And so not knowing what the federal government concerns were Canada-wide, I wasn't really in a position to have those concerns.
And in your view, did you support the use of the Emergencies Act?
I never turned my mind as to whether I supported the act. I can tell you that the authorities granted by the Federal Emergencies Act were helpful, and they were used by law enforcement.
Now, humorously enough, Di Tomaso mentioned that the right to protest, quote unquote, does not apply to trucks. He compared the protest in Ottawa to the protest taking place in Toronto. Take a look at his exact words.
Toronto did was they set up a hard perimeter around the critical infrastructure that the protesters were most interested in, namely Queen's Park. They requested resources from other police services to help them do that. At the end of the day, they denied access to Queen's Park Circle, hospital access roads, University Avenue down to Hospital Row. So all of that was denied to the convoys that were coming to Toronto. So the trucks, vehicles were not permitted into that area. They certainly facilitated the ability to exercise one's fundamental rights to lawful protest. Those truckers were available to come to Queen's Park and protest on foot because, as we know, the right to protest belongs to people and not to trucks.
Di Tomaso also stated that when prior to the Emergencies Act being invoked, he called Deputy Minister of Public Safety Rob Stewart to figure out if the act would be invoked, and no response was given. That's in this transcript. There was silence, the evidence shows. Take a look.
We make some notes in relation to a call with Deputy Minister Stewart. At 8:55, I inquire as to whether Federal Emergencies Act will be invoked today. Silence. What was your interest in inquiring about the Federal Emergencies Act?
Well, he had signaled to me the day before that the federal government was considering the invocation of the act. And this call here, I wanted to know whether or not that was in fact happening. He did not answer my question.
Okay, and did you take that to mean that that was the affirmative in not wanting to answer one way or the other?
Yes.
Was the province expecting this to happen, or was this just you asking, or were you asking on behalf of others?
This was me asking.
Okay. Do you know whether the Solicitor General or the Premier were expecting the government to invoke the Emergencies Act?
No.
Finally, following the day's proceedings, we invited Tom Marazzo, key figure of the Freedom Convoy, to our live stream.
Listened to some of the testimony earlier on in the morning, and obviously, whenever they were talking about the military and that testimony came up, I perked up a little bit and started to listen a little bit more. But I don't really think that part of the conversation is overly newsworthy. Mm-hmm. But it was interesting to me to see that there was an attempt in Alberta to have the military get involved and provide them with some heavy equipment or towing capacity. But I think the witness today was talking about how frustrated he was that he knew, because in his organization, they had retired military there that were kind of giving advice in terms of what military equipment they could have to go and start towing trucks. But the Canadian Forces struggles desperately to keep a lot of its equipment serviceable. And so it doesn't mean that, just because the military would say, hey, we can't support you in what you're asking for, doesn't mean they don't have the equipment. It just might mean that it's actually not serviceable. Mm-hmm. And so that's always a challenge for the military. So I think, when they kind of paint that narrative that, the military couldn't do the job, it's kind of true, but not through any resistance on the part of the military to get involved. But more importantly, for a province to request the military, they do have to go through the federal government to get that support. Just because they're co-located with the military in that province with CFB Edmonton, they can't just go to Edmonton and say, hey, can you help us out here?
Well, there you have it. Here's everything that you need to know about what went on during the 21st day of the Emergencies Act inquiry here in Ottawa. The Liberal cabinet is set to testify next week, so definitely stay tuned for that. For Rebel News, this is William Diaz. If you want to support our independent journalism straight from Canada's national capital during the Emergencies Act inquiry, head on to truckercommission.com.